Same old game over.
You're gonna need a bigger potion. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for January 27th, 2025, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. It is not September.
Oh, that would have been fun.
Nor is it the 5th. But
that would have been a very meta way to do this review.
That would have been, and I'm sure some people did, assuming that the film was out at that time. I don't really remember when it had its initial release.
Yeah.
It was sometime in the early fall, I want to say. Maybe I can look that up.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back if it did release back in September or if it was a little bit later than that. It was...
It says here December 13th in the United States, but that could, I don't know if that's correct or not. It did play at Venice in late August. Yeah. So there you go. That was rather close to September 5th.
Okay. Yeah. So it was at least shown to people in the summer and maybe during, the Virgo month, right? So exactly. So at least it got close.
Yeah, it got close. So September 5, it played at Venice in late August, as we just noted. However, while it got a limited release for an awards run in December, it is now expanding into January, especially because it has received, some lukewarm reviews from critics. It did receive an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay. Yeah. So there's that as well. We'll talk about that screenplay and if that nomination was worth it. We'll get into it.
Oh, there's a tone there. I think you've already answered that question.
We'll see. Look, I'm not prejudging. We'll get into it. But yeah, we're here to talk about September 5. This film will forever be associated, though, and I can't remember which critic was leading this charge, but after it played at Venice for a long time, for months, this film was heralded as the next Best Picture winner at the Oscars, and nobody was talking about it except the one critic.
I forget who that was. I'm
trying to remember who that was.
And that's not a knock on this individual who was saying that, because this movie does have a vibe to it that does feel very awards friendly. It kind of reminds me of why movies like Spotlight, for instance, were so well regarded. Not saying that they're just as good as each other. We'll talk about maybe the quality of differences there. But I could see why maybe someone might think an awards body will go for a film like this. Yeah. But for reasons we'll talk about, maybe the difference is it's just not quite good enough.
Perhaps that is indeed the case. But yeah, we'll talk about it. It did not get a nomination for Best Picture, so the campaign didn't quite work. But it did get, as I noted, a nomination for Best Original Screenplay, and it has popped up with other various critics groups here and there.
Yeah. So it's not like the awards bodies forgot that it exists.
Yeah. But it's been, I'd say, below the radar generally. Than it has been one of the heavy contenders, which maybe makes its screenplay nomination a little surprising, at least slightly. But that is to say, September 5 has generally been top of mind for a lot of people in our world anyway, maybe not so much with mainstream audiences. September 5, though, is a film that even if you don't know about it or you don't know the events that it's covering, you are probably familiar with it in some way. It is covering the same events that was covered in Steven Spielberg's Munich. It came out in the early 2000s. And generally, the 1972 Munich massacre is well known. It is taught in the history books. At least it was until the history books started to change over the last 5 years. But that's a conversation for another time. We are not a politics podcast. Yeah.
But it is worth noting that this event in 1972 was, as the movie puts it, the first ever televised terrorist event. And I think 900 million people tuned in for this. And this was all from ABC, as the movie alludes to as well.
Absolutely. Okay, with that, are you ready to dig in then?
Yeah, let's do this.
Okay, September 5 is directed by Tim Fehlbaum, and it stars Peter Sarsgaard, John Magaro, Ben Chaplin, Leonie Beanish, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. Those are certainly our major players that we'll focus on here. Benjamin Walker as Peter Jennings. I guess I'll throw him in there as well.
Yeah.
I know I guess we just talked about the gist of the film and the synopsis, but I'll read it just in case. During the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, Germany, an American sports broadcasting team must adapt to live coverage of the Israeli athletes being held hostage by a terrorist group. I have problems with said synopsis that we'll get into. Yeah, we'll talk about it.
I got to read that plot synopsis again because I almost feel like you just read the plot synopsis for Munich instead.
Yeah. Look, look. We'll get into it, but man, it doesn't read well. I'll just say that. I guess depending on the side of the aisle that you sit, but from my point of view, there are problems there. We'll talk about it though. Let's get into it. Brendan, what did you think about September 5?
I know we're being a little bit harsh already out of the gate with regard to this movie. I don't think it's bad. I actually think there are a lot of good qualities in this one. I think as a historical relic of a movie, and what I mean by that is as a representation of a behind the scenes historical event, I do think it is pretty fascinating to see the what of it all. I think if anything, and this is where I think the film's nomination for Best Original Screenplay is kind of hilarious, I think the best qualities of this movie really come down to its performances and its direction. I think it's a very thrilling movie. I think it's at times a very entertaining movie, a lifting of the curtain of what goes on behind the scenes within broadcast journalism, especially when they're put into a position that's maybe beyond their pay grade, and the commitment to that. I think all of that is very fascinating. And for a brisk 90 or so minutes that this movie is, I was entertained. I'm not thinking about it afterwards, though. And I know a lot of people have talked about that. There have been a lot of reviews out there using a certain word that we'll talk about, and that word is apolitical, right? And that's going to be, in many ways, maybe the basis of our review and whether this movie actually does work or not as a thinking piece, right? I don't know if it really gets there. I really don't, which is why its nomination for screenplay is kind of baffling in many ways. But I do think it is a pretty efficient movie. It's a very entertaining movie, and I was engaged by the mechanics of it all. I wouldn't necessarily say that I was emotionally connected with any of these people. They're really just there to move plot along. But I think as a lifting of that curtain, like I said earlier, I do think it is entertaining to watch, even if it doesn't really amount to anything by the end, for reasons I think we're going to get pretty heavily into as this conversation unfolds.
Yeah, I do think this film is a mixed bag overall. I do agree with you, though. I don't want to sit here and be completely or overly harsh on the film because it is a well-crafted political thriller. It's the kind of movie that genuinely would have been a major Oscar player 30 years ago. The production design is really good. The performances are great. John Magaro and Ben Chaplin are particularly excellent here.
Sure.
Fehlbaum's direction is solid. It is tense and thrilling. It's immersive. There's an old school grip that the movie has dramatically that in a vacuum I do really appreciate because we are getting less and less of these each year.
Yeah.
However, as you were just talking about, the film also presents itself in this journalistic, apolitical way that I think is disingenuous because it makes choices that are political. And not just in terms of characters who are deeply affected by these events, something the film intently makes note of. They are not objective observers. But it's also how it portrays all of this happening to Germany in a post-Holocaust world. There is a lot to unpack with just that alone. Yet the film refuses refuses to do anything meaningful with its political underbelly. It doesn't want to acknowledge it. It just puts on earmuffs and pretend it is not there, which makes no sense given the state of the world at that time, or any time really. When has anything ever been apolitical? Maybe it was unintentional, as the film does want to emphasize these characters and their journalistic integrity. But that point of view is a facade, as it does choose a side while offering no context as to why these things are happening in 1972. Context that is absolutely vital to the conflict happening in the Middle East. By neglecting that, you are making a political statement, again, even if unintentional. So as much as I appreciate the craft of this film, the screenplay leaves a lot to be desired for me. A lot. To say that the nomination is baffling is being awfully nice. Because it is, I think, by far the worst thing about this film. If it somehow got into production design or cinematography or costuming, not that I would not have nominated it for any of that, but that would have made much more sense.
That makes sense in recreating 1972. I get
exactly. That. In recreating 1972, the film is immersive. And I do think there is a lot to enjoy in the moment, as you were talking about. But the screenplay? No, absolutely not.
The whole apolitical narrative around this movie is the thing that sort of baffles me the most. And I think that's because it's a narrative that I feel like, and I'm not, criticizing any one person or any group of people or anything like that. But I feel like it's a word that film critics who reviewed this movie early tried to find to defend this thing. Because I don't really think this is a movie that's trying to be quote unquote apolitical. A movie like Alex Garland's Civil War from last year, which is a film that you and I didn't really go for, but I can at least give Alex Garland some credit when he says he's trying to make something that is apolitical. That is at least what he's trying to do. I don't think that movie really succeeds in that regard, but that's at least maybe the movie's ethos. It's trying to make a statement about what it means to be impartial in a political world, right? I think if anything, September 5 is really just an empty movie. And it just comes off as apolitical because it refuses to engage in certain things, which I guess in a way,
maybe that's it.
In a way, refusing to engage in politics ultimately is the definition of apolitical. But I think there's a huge difference between a movie that's utilizing the apolitical notion as a thematic idea, as opposed to one that's just maybe inadvertently using it just to play it safe. And I feel like this is more so the latter. It just feels apolitical because the movie is ultimately kind of empty. Because you're also right. It is, given the circumstances, given the fact that this group of sports journalists choose to portray this event for the public, that is a political statement. That's a political gesture. It absolutely is. So the movie can't be apolitical in that regard, which is why I think it really just becomes this almost like this accident that that it just ends up having nothing to say on the subject. I don't think it's trying to be apolitical. I think it's, if anything, it's just a half-baked idea.
Yeah, I either way, it does come off disingenuous because it feels as if apolitical was its agenda, however it might arrive there, and perhaps the avenue in which you're articulating there is more apt. I don't know. Either way, I do find it disingenuous. And I think what's really interesting and ironic is that these characters who, as you noted, as we talked about even in the synopsis, they are sports. They're the sports arm of ABC. Right, it was ABC covering this.
Yeah.
And I love the irony that these characters who are there for the Olympics, these characters fight for journalistic integrity to cover this event in real time. In order to do so, they have to fight the studio heads back in America in order to pull this off. Now, when there is pushback from the studio heads, I wonder why that might be. Could it perhaps be political?
I think
perhaps.
so.
Just
I
wondering.
think so. Yeah.
Corporate politics generally are a challenge, and that is absolutely what is at play to some degree. But in corporate television, you also have to consider world politics or national politics, depending on the situation, I guess. That's so completely brazen when it comes to the news media in the US. I mean, it is propagandistic with the major outlets today. But even in 1972, the studio heads wanted the spin to be a certain way. That's why they wanted the politics news desk to cover this story instead of the sports guys.
Right.
So when Peter Sarsgaard's Rooney Eldridge character calls the studio back in the States, that's what he's fighting back against. And this film refuses to engage in any of that. The idea that the pushback in itself is political, but there's very little exploration of that, let alone the missing context of Israel and Palestine and why that is important here. There is just absolutely zero information on that conflict in this film. No context. But some of these characters who are noted to be Jewish, they are deeply affected by what they see.
Yeah, they make that very clear. So by making that clear, I mean, that's already a political gesture to add within the movie. Yeah,
exactly. And the film doesn't wrestle with that. It doesn't wrestle with it. And that to me is my issue here. I don't care that it chooses a side. That's not my problem. Especially with these characters being Jewish and it's Jewish hostages, or Israeli hostages, I should say. Of course they're going to be affected by that. So you can't pretend to be apolitical when it is very political at its core, and these characters are responding to that political conflict.
And we talked about this when we reviewed Alex Garland's Civil War, not to, go back to that movie a second time, but there is a very big difference between apolitical and refusing to take a side. Those are not the same thing. Refusing to take a side is not apolitical. If anything, maybe you can call that, I don't know, moderate, I guess. I mean, that's still a political association, right? But it's not apolitical. And I think we're at a point now where a lot of people are conflating the two, thinking that refusing to take a side means apolitical. It's not. It's absolutely not.
Well, and this isn't even refusing to take a side. It chooses a side.
It does choose a side. You're absolutely right.
But it pretends that it doesn't.
Well, it pretends that it doesn't. Yeah. But again, by saying you're not choosing a side, that's still it's still in a way a political gesture, right?
Yeah,
it's still a political choice. Which then goes back to my next question: is there even a such thing as an apolitical movie? I don't think there is. I really don't think there is.
Well, and I know I somewhat joked about it in my opening thoughts, although it really wasn't much of a joke. I don't know if anything is apolitical.
Yeah.
Especially these days. It feels like everything that we see, every debate, everything has some sort of political angle to it. I don't know if
maybe not the most maybe not literally rooted in, let's just say, Congress or something like that, right? Maybe not literally rooted in politics of Washington, but at the very least, everything is sociopolitical, right? Disney Pixar's Luke is a political movie. I mean, like these are all, there's politics everywhere. You can't really escape it. And I don't say that as a bad thing. I say that as praising something as apolitical. I don't know if that's even possible. Like, I just don't think it is.
Yeah, I don't think it is. And if the perspective is meant to be journalistic, then you have to provide facts about the situation. Journalism is about covering, at least the way it's presented here. It's not trying to be journalism as it is today, which, as I noted a moment ago, everything is so completely biased and filtered through some sort of propagandistic lens, whatever you choose to view. And thankfully there are some great apps out there that help filter some of this out, because if you don't know, you're often reading something from a website that has either a liberal lens to it or a conservative lens.
Yeah.
And that can often be, vague or conflating.
Yeah.
At any rate, that is to say, everything today often has some sort of giant political leaning,
They have some type of
but
agenda.
they have some sort of agenda. This film wants to present itself as journalism when it was pure. We were there. We wanted to cover it in real time. We're 60 feet away from the events that's happening. We just want to cover it as it is. We are journalists. We are capital J journalists. It doesn't matter that we're here for the Olympics. We're going to cover this. It's ours.
Well,
That's
if that is the case, there's maybe an argument to be made that the movie kind of collapses on itself because, and this is actually something I kind of like about the movie. I wish it delved into this idea further. This idea that by choosing these sports journalists, by choosing to partake in this reporting, may have actually exacerbated the issue even worse. They may have actually created this ripple effect that actually led to the devastating outcome that actually happened.
From a practical, tactical perspective, those elements I do think are interesting, and because you are right, there's moments where what's happening in this hotel room with these hostages, it's a direct effect of what they're watching on television.
Well, they even say that at the end of the movie, or at least I think it's John Magaro's character that says to everyone else, "Did we cause this? Did this happen because of us?" And I think I think that's actually a very interesting notion. I wish the movie was more about that.
I was just about to say, at least the film was willing to engage with something.
That at least had a dialogue to it.
That had a dialogue. I did appreciate that angle of it. However, if you're going to present yourself as capital J journalist, and again, from a tactical, pragmatic perspective, getting the cameras out, what angles are we going to look at? We have to sneak in one of our interns, or he probably wasn't an intern, but one of the workers there. He has to sneak into, the isolated base there so he can get close to what's happening. That stuff, again, in a vacuum, I think is really interesting.
I agree.
I
agree. That stuff was fun to watch. I thought that was really fun to watch.
That stuff was great. No, I agree. Totally agree. However, if you're going to present yourself as that, but then you fail to give us the facts and the context of what led to this, why is any of this happening? That's where you lose all integrity and credibility, and it just becomes propaganda. Now, the actual ABC broadcast might have done that, but that's not what we're watching. We're watching a movie of how all of this came to be from their perspective as they're in Munich. And the film doesn't want to give us any of that.
Yeah.
All we see are these characters acting in a superficial way without really digging into why these things are happening, let alone that this is happening to Germany in a post-Holocaust world, which the film does bring up at one point as well. And again, just doesn't really want to get into that. It just kind of brings it up.
It's an interesting question as to whether the people there in Munich, as they're broadcasting this, whether they question how it's going to be perceived when it actually goes live and goes on air. Is it going to be twisted differently? I liked watching John Magaro's Jeffrey Mason sort of act as kind of like a director. He's kind of like this filmmaker of sorts, pulling all of these strings to make everything happen. But what they're trying to capture, could that have gotten skewed when it actually got broadcast live? I think that's something that gets toyed with a little bit. Again, I'm saying that to say there are individual ideas here that I think are way more interesting, and I just wish the movie explored them as opposed to going the route that it actually does go. I think by the end, like I said earlier, I think this is a pretty empty experience.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it gets even more egregious in terms of its one-sided point of view when the film doesn't really want to dig into why these things are happening. And again, I'm not asking for a history lesson. All I'm asking for, under the guise of journalism, especially the 1972 purity, pure definition of it that this film wants to be, at least give us some sort of basis that these characters can react to. but
Yeah.
we don't really get that. And in fact, it goes one step further where it labels this act as terrorism, a term that was apparently born out of this event. At least that's what the film wants you to think, which
Oh, yeah.
isn't true at all.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how the film presents, it kind of presents that term, and it becomes
Sure.
like this heightened moment in the film. Again, when you understand the context of what led to that, it becomes like there's so much more complexity and nuance to it that makes that scene feel, again, just completely disingenuous to me. And again, one-sided, like completely one-sided. So, I don't know.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
you're going to have a
there's-
journalism film, but it slants one way so heavily, it completely
You might as
takes
well just
me out of the
lean
movie.
into it. Might as well just lean into it at that
Or
point.
lean into it. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
if you were like Tarantino brazen and just like screw
Yeah.
the one like middle finger to the air, maybe
Yeah.
I would have respected it a little bit more. But
At least it would have felt like that there was a conviction to it. But that's
yeah,
that's
exactly.
what
There's
that's
no conviction or backbone here. Yeah, that's your point.
there's
how-
there's a common thing that I feel like is overused, a common phrase that's overused when talking about movies that don't ultimately work. And I hate to say it here, but I think it's the perfect representation of this movie. Missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's a big missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And so like that's why it's a mixed bag. I think as a thriller, it's fine.
It's
I think
effective.
there's
Yeah.
a lot to it's effective.
Yeah,
Again,
it's a great made for TNT 90s thriller.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to admit that my own subjectivity certainly plays a part to this as well. I think this film kind of gets to a line where it can, like, I can see how some people would find this film borderline offensive given
Sure.
the lack of context here.
Yeah.
But it is kind of pandering to a certain demographic that I'm just like, which isn't me. So like there is kind of a subjective element to that, I guess. So, I mean, take my thoughts for what it's worth, but
Sure.
and like I would have been willing, as I noted earlier, I don't care that it wanted to pick a side. To your point, have some sort of backbone. Like if you're going to pick a side, just go full on into it. Like give us that perspective. Then I would have been able to engage with the film, I think. But the pretending and the facades,
that's the dangerous thing with movies like this, whether they try to be apolitical or not. Usually the byproduct is a movie that just feels afraid to commit to something. And that's not to say it has to commit to a political idea. It has to be even more heavily political. I don't necessarily mind the attempt at being a little bit distant from that, but you have to do so with conviction. Again, going back to Alex Garland's Civil War, once again, a movie I don't love, but at least he had conviction to try to emulate that idea. I think he failed, but at least he felt like he wanted to tell that thematic arc. So like I give him more credit there than I do here, if that is ultimately what this movie's intent is.
I agree. I don't think there's any pretending with Civil War. Like I think it goes full bore into what it is. It does stumble. I do agree, but at least it knows what it wants to be.
Yeah.
And this, like as a thriller, it knows what it wants to be. But
just everything underneath that.
Thematically, emotionally, you can't be down the middle given what this is and how these characters react. You can't just be down the middle and then show us a character like running outside because this plane takes or these helicopters take off and this might be the end and they have to get a last. Like that is a very political choice.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely is. Yeah.
Like we're just gonna pretend that's not okay.
I was trying to defend this movie a little bit because, like we talked about, it's an effective thriller. As a thriller, it's effective. But man, it sounds like we don't like the movie, and I'm starting to not like the movie now because
I don't like I'm more on I don't like it than I do. Like, it's one of those where I don't like it, but I respect its craft is maybe the best way for me to phrase it.
It sits in that 2.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd for me, where it just like really straddles that middle line.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I finally caught up with this maybe 3 or 4 days ago, and I'm honestly struggling even with this review to try to remember everything that I saw. It just because like as much as I know I enjoyed watching it in the moment, I respond to these underlying things, whether it be emotional, thematic, political, sociopolitical, whatever it is. I feel like those are the things that I find most memorable in most movies nowadays.
Yeah.
And this just doesn't have it. It just doesn't have it.
Yeah. Looking at it half glass full, I will say I do appreciate its nomination for Best Original Screenplay because we don't get movies like this a whole lot anymore. These are becoming more and more of a rarity as the years go on. But I like these kind of movies. I want Hollywood to make more movies like this. I don't want it.
Yeah.
I don't want filmmakers to have to brutalist their way to making these kind of movies.
Yeah. The solution to that, to make everyone happy, I think, would have been to nominate Juror Number 2 instead.
And that is the best solution for sure. Like, I agree with that. I agree with that. But you know, if I will say, as much as I love that movie, Juror Number 2, that is, and really like it, and I think that deserves more of a spot than September 5. If September 5 being nominated keeps that top of mind for studio heads to do more of these, because look, this got an Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay. Maybe we'll do another one like it.
Light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing.
Then yes, I can live with that nomination, because the Oscars is a marketing ploy anyway. That's all that it is.
That's true. Yeah.
So if that's what it takes to get more of these, then I can live with it. It's a trade-off I'm willing to have.
Yeah, I'm glad it exists in that way.
Exactly. Yeah,
I won't watch it
more
again, but I'm glad it exists in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, more of these, just, more
Juror Number 2s. More Juror Number 2s and not September 5s.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. Okay, well, I think we can end things there. If you agree or disagree with us, and look, a lot of you may have really liked this. Maybe you don't agree with how I view about it politically. That's perfectly fair and understandable. I'd be willing to hear your thoughts. So if you disagree with us, leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. With that, we have another review that we dropped yesterday, as this one is released, where we talked about Soderbergh and Presence.
Good movie.
And the main show this week was episode 621, where Ryan McQuaid, the great, wonderful Ryan McQuaid, we do love him. He joined us to talk about the Oscars, the Oscar nominations,
AKA sports,
specifically. AKA sports. Yeah, we had a sports conversation.
We did. Yeah.
And it was a great time.
Yeah. By literally talking about sports on the same day that both the NFC and AFC championship games were happening.
Exactly. And the Oscar nominations, it's all sports. It's fun.
It is all sports. Yeah.
At any rate, be sure to go and check all that out. There's going to be a new Women in Session, new Chasing the Gold. Lots of Sundance content on the website and at sessionfilm.com this week. With that, we'll go ahead and get out of here. And stay tuned. We have some more fun stuff on the horizon that I'm very, very excited to get into as we get into February and the spring.
Yep.
And it'll be the summer before you know it. So
I know. Time's weird.
I know. With that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.
September 5 giving the month of September a bad name.